Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. We're so happy to have you. Right now, we're at a little over 100 participants, and we are expecting about 200 to 220 of you. So we will have a sizable group of people sharing this morning with us in our webinar. This will be a view-only event, but we are also providing some opportunities for audience engagement. There will be a few polls that we will run through the presentation. And towards the end, there'll be more information on how to give us your insights, feedback, thoughts, and comments so that we can integrate them into the project. Also, we'll be sharing these slides with everyone who's registered for the presentation. So don't worry about the information that you've seen briefly as we move through the slides, but you weren't able to capture it if you were taking notes. We will be providing these slides and the recording publicly to everyone who's both registered and for those who are interested in more information. Nima, next slide, please. And I'll turn this over to Sharon Bush.
Thanks, Kaliba, and good morning, everyone. My name is Sharon Bush. I'm the Executive Director of Grand Victoria Foundation and also a longtime member of Chicago African Americans in Philanthropy. Just wanted to do some quick introductions around the partners for the Illinois Black Advocacy Project before we jump into more explanation about what we've done. But want to introduce as partners to the project mostly around funding. Chicago African Americans in Philanthropy has been huge around helping to keep us organized and focused. Grand Victoria Foundation is a partner. We have helped to fund the project along with the JB and MK Pritzker Family Foundation, Julian Grace, and the Staines Family Foundation. In particular, Jessica Dudley, Andrea Palmer, myself, and Yolanda Knight from the Staines Family Foundation make up a bit of a steering committee that has really guided the work over the last several months. Also, the folks who've been doing the work that you'll hear more about today are the folks from Wilburn Strategic Solutions. That includes Kaliba Wilburn, who you'll hear more from later, Nima Krobel, and John Bowman. So now I think I'll just hand it off to Jessica Dudley. We're going to do a little bit of audience engagement before we get started.
Thanks, Sharon. We would love to know who's in the room with us today. I want to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what sectors are represented so we know both who we're talking to and who we can get some feedback from. So we are going to launch a poll. Our first poll, there will be more. And if you could please share with us what sector you're in so that we can have an understanding of who's joining us today. Also want to note as you are filling out this quick poll that we do have the chat open and we will be monitoring it. Given that there may be about 200 folks in the room, we may not be able to answer all your questions, but we'll certainly be saving that information. And so if you have thoughts, feedback, information you want to share in the chat, we will certainly be collecting that information. And Nima, I'm looking to you to make sure that we've got responses coming in, that folks are participating, and we're getting some idea of who's joining us today.
Yeah, we're close to 90% participation on poll 1, so we're going to share some of those results now. And then we'll go to the second poll.
Wonderful. So lots of nonprofit representation in the room, which we expected. Good to see our philanthropy partners here and to know that we have corporate, government, and some other folks in the room. So again, also welcome you to share in the chat anything else you'd like to share about who's in the room today. I'm going to keep us moving and ask that we go to our next poll. We'd love to know who was able to join us for the webinar in June of last year. So as we'll talk about throughout this morning, a lot of this work was inspired by the incredible reception and high attendance to the webinar that we did in June, where we had an opportunity to hear from leaders across the state about the impact of COVID-19 on Black communities. And so want to get a sense of how many of you were able to join that webinar or perhaps have viewed the webinar through our YouTube page since that event happened.
We'll give it a few more seconds, although the results are coming in quickly. I'm going to end this poll as we're close to a majority of who hasn't attended.
Thank you all for joining early and participating quickly. Okay, so the majority of folks were not able to join that. We will make sure in our follow-up that we also share the video of that conversation so you can see sort of what was the genesis of this. But thank you to the 30% or so of you who have participated with us throughout this journey and who are a part of that call to action for these groups. We are going to dig into the work, but there will be some more polls coming. So thank you for sort of demonstrating your willingness to participate early in the morning, and we will continue to be interacting with you through polls as this conversation moves forward.
Terrific. Thanks, Jessica. It's nice to see who's in the room and to see who's been following what we've been doing over the last several months. I'll just quickly go over the agenda and just really read from the slide. So we will, for those who haven't been part of this, we'll do a little bit of project background and description, and that'll be a refresher for others who've been following along this work. I will go over those two things. And then the last three things, the overview, themes, highlights, and next steps, you'll hear from Khalifa Wilburn to do that. So if you can go to the next slide. Just a little bit of context around like where this work is coming from. And really, it just goes without saying how incredible of a year we had last year in 2020. And it built a lot of urgency around thinking about what does it mean to have a unified effort around advocacy and organizing that benefits the entire state. So in 2020, like I can just repeat all of the things that we know, which is COVID-19 really illuminated, probably exacerbated a lot of racial inequities that we've seen over time. Also, there was tremendous response to violence that was particularly against Black people. I think there's another piece where it is a lot of the efforts of protesting and unrest was around the lack of accountability that you saw that was related to that really unified and brought people together. There was tremendous response in terms of people protesting, uprising, unrest around the country, really around the world, but that was a huge response to what was happening in terms of people not wanting to see where there's movement to advance racial justice in the country. And all of that was the result of incredible movement building that we've seen historically throughout the country and also here in our own state. So really lots of urgency around what happened last year. I think, you know, it bears repeating that 2020 illuminated a lot of Black powered movement building and organizing. We saw that obviously with Black Lives Matter. We've seen that also very clearly with what Stacey Abrams and other grassroots organizers have been doing in Georgia around voter engagement. And one of the things that we really want to stress is that this kind of work has really gone on for years in many places. And it really can lift up like what is good for not just Black people, but for everybody. So we're really excited about what we're learning about what's happening in Illinois. I think COVID in Illinois, particularly COVID-19 really demonstrated a need for coordinated movement building to really unify existing efforts that are happening around the state. Really, the webinar that we did in June was a response to just wanting to have a much clear and direct understanding about the conditions and what was happening to Black people throughout the state of Illinois in a way that we really hadn't seen before. And then for that webinar, we had hundreds of registrants for that, which really was an indication of demand for understanding and advocating for what's happening for Black people in Illinois. Next slide. So really just a little bit of more of the description, a little bit of context. So because of the events of 2020, we really set out to learn more about advocacy and organizing efforts throughout Illinois. We really wanted to understand the assets available for Black powered systems change and really what else was needed to have a unified effort around this. So you'll see in the first bullet point, we really wanted to recognize and identify the rich existing ecosystem of Black-led and Black-focused advocacy around the state. 2020 really demonstrated a strong need for more strong and more focused race-conscious and multi-issue advocacy. So really part of what this vision includes is a process that leads with community voice. You'll hear more from Kaliva about the folks that we talked to. And really, we don't make any assumptions about the outcome of this work of trying to figure out what exists, what's happening. We really just wanted to have a much better understanding of what's on the ground, and then to figure out next steps to determine how we can really have comprehensive, focused, unapologetic, Black statewide advocacy in Illinois. So with that, I'll hand it to Kaliva to talk more about the project in detail.
Good morning, everyone. So we had really 3 key aims and goals for the project. The first was to identify and interview a range of stakeholders and key informants on the need for this project and the potential impact of the proposed organization. We wanted to also identify and assess the operational and financial structures that could potentially make the organization successful and sustainable. And then finally, after the analysis was complete, to make a set of recommendations for the implementation of a new entity, or, if appropriate, building the capacity and the impact of either an existing organization or a combination of existing organizations. Next slide, please. And so these are the overview and the key goals for our work. The first was to conduct a landscape analysis of Black-led and Black-focused Illinois advocacy organizations. We examined the cross-sector stakeholder interviews and engagement. We talked to a range of people. There'll be more details on that. Our goal was also to review successful and aspirational, operational, and financial approaches to advocacy, particularly at the statewide level. Here, this goal aims to try and identify best practices, successful strategies to help a Black-led, Black-focused statewide entity be successful in the short and the long term. And then finally, the goal is to make a set of recommendations to implement this new entity or to build the capacity of existing entities, including those operational and financial strategies that we've identified, and including sustainability strategies, which would be identified through the work. Next slide, please. To lead this work, to set the tone, and to help define that landscape analysis, we worked with this group to create a definition for advocacy that would serve the project. For the purposes of this project, we defined advocacy as Black-led, working towards equity and justice and the liberation of all Black Illinoisans. That advocacy for this project would co-develop an agenda driven by community and community voice that included a range of statewide issues. This organization would be action-oriented, and it would work in partnership and in collaboration with others, not only in the rich ecosystem that exists of Black-led and Black-focused advocacy organizations, but also with key partners and key sectors for which we can march in unison to advance similar and parallel advocacy issues and efforts. And then finally, for the purposes of this project, the advocacy organization would uplift and empower Black-led voices and develop the next generation of Black leadership. Next slide, please. To support that definition, we also created a table of strategies and tactics to help define what we mean when we talk about advocacy in the context of the ways in which we defined it. Here in this table, you'll see a range of strategy and tactics and some examples of what that would be. You see here everything from community organizing and movement building to what we call professional advocacy like litigation and action research. But there's also coalition building, education, and of course, the power of media, messaging, and narrative shaping. Next slide, please. So once we had our operational definition to get us started, we worked with the stakeholder engagement. In our initial round, in the early stages, we interviewed over 50 key informants. And these informants came from the government sector. They were elected officials, philanthropic leaders, action researchers, and a range of advocacy practitioners at small and large organizations and all across the state of Illinois. Next slide. Through those interviews, we were also able to identify over 85 advocacy organizations that are operating on behalf of Black Illinoisans all across the state. They were Black-led and Black-focused. They work on both single issue and multi-issues of advocacy topics. They include action research as their focus, and many have statewide, but also many have regional focus for their work. Next slide, please. And through these interviews and through the landscape analysis, we were able to identify some preliminary themes and highlights. The first are the factors for success for an entity such as proposed by this project, which would be a statewide Black-led advocacy organization. That in order for it to be successful, it must collaborate and coordinate with other advocacy groups and complement but not compete across that ecosystem. It has to stand in solidarity with parallel movement efforts, building and organizing in tandem. It must bridge ideas and strategies across generational leaders, including building and creating and supporting the next generation of leadership. And finally, it must have operational and financial sustainability to sustain statewide advocacy, again, over a long time horizon, because as we all know, advocacy is not short-term work. It is ultimately long-term work. Next slide, please. We also identified through this preliminary set of interviews, what are the opportunities for such an organization to exist in this state? There was great consensus across all those 50 or more stakeholders that we talked to around the need, the timeliness, and the potential for this project and for the proposed entity. There was a recognition that there is a strong body of current work that exists across a rich ecosystem of Black advocacy, including movement building and organizing, which we've seen at play not only in Illinois, but also across this nation on behalf of Black people. And of course, the opportunity is that there is great work being done on a broad range of advocacy issues that's going on right now, and that it utilizes a variety of those strategies and tactics that we outlined in that table. Next slide, please. And of course, we stand on a tide of incredible momentum right now. The unfolding events in Washington and even in our own state of Illinois create a window of opportunity for policy progress and for this particular project. We see this momentum unfolding in the failed attempts to overturn a democratic, fair process in the most recent presidential election, that the Georgia and the national wins were driven heavily by Black organizers and voters, not only in Illinois, but across this country. And of course, as many of you all know, there's momentum right now on behalf of the Illinois Black Legislative Caucus as they begin to roll out their multi-issue agenda for Black Illinoisans. And the momentum is also seen as a need to accelerate and improve our statewide Black advocacy, to create that synergy, the collaboration, to build the power, and to build the collective voice. Next slide, please. Jessica, I'll turn this over to you, our next poll.
Thank you, Cleva. So we would love to get your feedback on the factors of success that Cleva walked us through. We want to understand, since we have such a wide representation of sectors and different organizations with us today, how you are understanding these factors as well. So Nima will open our next poll, and we'll ask you to just share with us what you see as the most important factor for success so that we can ensure we're aligning our work with these factors of success that are important for your work as well. And just give it one more moment. I'm sure many of these are a priority for you, and picking one might be a challenge, but would love to know sort of what's the top of the list for you. And there'll certainly be other opportunities for us to talk about how these overlap and where there are intersections across these opportunities and factors for success.
I'm going to give it a few more seconds, Jessica and attendees. All right, I think we're at a good percentage, so I'm going to end and share these results with you all.
Okay, so even though I know many of these are a priority, we have some clear votes for solidarity, movement building, and organizing efforts, along with collaboration and coordination. So thank you for sharing that feedback, and we will keep that in mind as we move this work forward. Cleve, I think I'm giving it back to you.
Thank you. Next slide. Thank you, Nima. Again, we are only midway through our work in this landscape analysis and in identifying those best practices, in understanding the ecosystem, and in identifying what are the opportunities, what are the needs and the assets within the community. And so we want to share with you what our next steps are as we move forward and wrap the project up. We'll be conducting a secondary set of interviews with advocacy informants and practitioners. We look to test what we've learned in our first set of information with those folks who do the work most actively on behalf of Black Illinoisans. We'll also be talking with local and national advocacy exemplars. These are institutions and organizations that are working currently statewide, have found successful models to do their work on behalf of similar constituencies. From these groups, we hope to learn more about those best practices, specifically the operational and the financial strategies that have kept them going and allowed them to do their work. And then we will be doing and conducting and finalizing an asset map that we hope will outline everything that we've learned that helps to identify who these players are that are working and in the field of advocacy on behalf of Black Illinoisans all across the state, and to summarize a set of recommendations for where this project will go next in order to stand up the organization as proposed by this project. Next slide, please. Jessica, turning it over to you.
Sorry, little technical difficulties with the buttons here. We want to make sure and want to make clear that this is not the last opportunity for engagement with this conversation. This is really just an opportunity for us to share out how the work is progressing, to keep all of you as stakeholders informed. And so it would be helpful for us to know how you'd like to continue to be engaged in this work. How can we continue to keep you updated and share out the findings that we are learning? So I'm going to ask Nima to open our next poll, which will ask you to share how we should continue to engage you in this work. Hopefully this webinar was a format that worked for folks, but want to make sure that we're reaching you in the way that works best for you to receive information. Nima checking in to see if we're getting some good response rates this one. I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of all of the above, but want to see sort of what the preferences are for folks.
You might be right about that. I'm going to end it because we're close to getting most of the votes in, and it's overwhelming.
Perfect. And I see some questions coming into the Q&A, appreciating those. Yep, as I suspected, all of the above. Wonderful. Okay, so certainly following this call, we'll be sending out communications to everyone, sharing that first webinar, some updates, and we will continue to find ways to engage all of you. I believe on the next slide is also mine. We also want to offer that We know that there wasn't opportunity for sort of long form feedback in this opportunity. And so I am happy to receive your communications, thoughts, feedback, opportunities for collaboration at our Chicago African Americans and Philanthropy inbox. So please feel free to reach out. I will be sharing those communications with this group, with the sort of steering committee that we have, thinking about how we can incorporate your feedback into this work. So I see lots of questions coming into the Q&A. We'll think about how to communicate answers back on those, as well as sort of any of the messages that you're sending to our info@cape.org email address. Cleva, I think I'm sending it back to you.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. And thank you to everyone. Again, as Jessica mentioned, we'll be collecting all of the information that you sent to us at info@cape.org. And particularly, we're interested in knowing what your aspirations are for this effort. Our project is only in its first stages. There will be many other stages, and your feedback is critical to how that work is shaped and formed. Of course, we will also be sharing all the communications that you've asked us to send through the all of the above opportunity that you selected. So we have our work cut out for us, and we'll be doing that. So in the coming weeks and months, please keep your eye out for more information on this project, for feedback on your questions, and also just a sharing out of all of the great comments, recommendations that you shared with us in the chat. And we thank you again for joining us this morning. Have a great day.